I'm using a big voice, and I'm going to be getting really close to Karen because she has a mic right there. I'm not being inappropriate. And
could be a cultural thing.
It could be a cultural thing, yeah. But I'm really delighted. My name is Todd Odgers. I work at Norquest, and I direct one of the Centers for Excellence that we have here. And it was 2.5 or so years ago that we ran the first one of these events here at Norquest, and Karen introduced me. And I'm delighted today to be able to introduce Karen. Karen is probably a very familiar face to all of you here because she has been the training manager or the training coordinator in the past, and she's done a number of really great community engagements with the HR community and other professional development communities. 20 years ago, she fell in love with helping adults learn, and she started as a fitness instructor. You can see how strong she is. Before she moved into literacy, ESL, and now finally corporate training. She's a former one-room school teacher in Northwest Territories. She's enjoyed working in all sectors with various kinds of learners, including business people, diamond miners. She's not a gold digger. She's a diamond miner. Do you have a diamond?
Yes.
Yeah, oh, good, good. Aboriginal elders and New Canadians. Now, tonight she's going to talk about a bit of an evolution in her career, something that she sees as a very important learning opportunity. It's about evaluation, training evaluation, right? And she values transfer of learning, or the link between workplace learning and workplace performance. She's kind of an overachiever, and she did her master's degree in both fields. So instructional and performance technology, instructional and performance technology at Boise State, and workplace and adult learning from the University of California.
Calgary.
Good, just checking. Calgary. But you would like to go to University of Calgary, California.
Of course.
Now, this is the interactive part, the start. Many of you don't know that Karen secretly loves to see her name in print. So could you please take a look at one of those brown envelopes and just open it up and face what you get this direction. We want to make this an interactive experience. Could you just hold it up? Hold it up. Yep, good.
Oh,
yep.
Oh, I'm seeing my name everywhere.
Your name is in print. There you are. She's been published in the International Journal of Management and Performance Improvement. Miss Karen Carlton is the president of Performance Solutions Corp. And she really hopes that this session can be informative and fun. She's going to be presenting practical instructional design insights. So please help me and welcome tonight's speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. I have a question. How many of you want to create engaging training where people learn and they end up being able to perform better? Most of you. The rest of you can leave. Well, tonight I'm going to share with you some practical design insights, and I'm confident that you'll take away at least one new idea or validate what you're currently doing. Isn't that great? Now, what I do want to do as well overall, I want to bring some focus to how you educate people effectively, efficiently, meaningfully, and with that link and that mindset to performance improvement, not just check we've had a butt in a seat. We want to get that result. So the 4 practical insights that we're going to cover tonight, one would be the adult learning keys that I've put together 3 of them. They're a composite of adult learning theory principles from Malcolm Knowles. We'll also look at learning versus performance objectives and look at how those are different. Many of you are probably familiar with Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. Does that ring in a few bells? Yes? People are going, who is that? You'll know by the end of the night. And we'll also touch on the transfer of learning, or the ability and what you can do to help people apply what they've learned, so therefore they get performance improvement in their job. So we're going to start with the keys to adult learning. Now, when you think of the difference between adult learners and child learners, the main thing is prior learning experience. Adults have a whole wealth of experiences and knowledge that they're drawing upon, whether it's similar or very related to the topic at hand. So it really forms the foundation of the learning. So your prior learning or your prior experience helps bridge and connect to that new information. So if you've, say, driven a car and you've never driven a haul truck and you're learning how to drive a haul truck, you can think about, okay, my previous experience was driving, there's a brake, there's gears, what have you. You'll be able to make that connection, and it actually makes your learning stick better if you tap into the prior learning of adults. So it actually builds that bridge, that foundation, and creates for more meaningful and memorable learning. So thinking about prior learning and tapping into how people have learned before about that topic or what they already know, I'd like to hear a couple of strategies. How do you do that with your learners? How do you get them to think about what they already know or can do related to your field? Russ?
Usually ask questions, and when we're talking or presenting a topic, it's just simply asking about who in the room has had some experience with this. And
asking questions of the learners to see who has experience. Great, thank you. Any others? Any other strategies to help tap into that prior experience about that topic at hand? Radka?
Do a pre-test.
Do a pre-test. Excellent. Yeah, you can pre-test, so find out what they've already known or how competent they are in that field. Excellent. And at the same time, that's a great way to target what you're going to develop and deliver for instruction, but also to see how competent they are. And it can raise the students' confidence as well. Now I've assembled some of the next learning key from a few principles of Malcolm Knowles, the adult learning theorist. And I like acronyms, I think they're cute. So I put this one together as RON. And the first one would be readiness to learn. Adults have a readiness. They have a need to know this information, but it relates to what's going on in their lives. So it could be personally, professionally, but they're ready and they're poised to learn something. They also have an orientation to problem solve. Learning is really a means to an end, whether it's workplace or personal learning. You need to learn something, so you have that orientation that it's going to help you do something. And finally, you have a need to know. This is not typically, oh, why not just learn something for fun? Now at the same time, and Radka is probably thinking to herself, hello, continuing education, and she's absolutely right. There are exceptions, the person who wants to simply learn something for the sake of learning. However, for the most part, we have a need to know. Adults are very time pressed, and so anything that's efficient and focused on what they want to learn is how you want to design your learning. So whether your learners need to learn English, they're English as a second language speakers, or they're with global TV and they need to learn how to use that sound machine properly. So really, whatever the case may be, whatever your groups are learning, you want to make sure it's directly relevant. And I was telling, I believe, Tammy and Rosa from the city back there, and I was telling you that you've got to be careful. I think it was you two that I was talking to. You've got to be careful of the seductive details. When you're planning, especially if you're the subject matter expert, and I'm bad for that too, you get so excited, you want to share all the details because it's all important and it's all wonderful. But at the same time, we have a capacity problem with our memories, and you have to focus in on what's most important, because that's what needs to be delivered and what needs to be repeated. People aren't going to remember if they just hear it once, right? So in terms of relevance, I'll give you one example of how you can tailor both your instructional methods and your instructional materials to make them more meaningful. Even if the content is the same, but if your learners have different characteristics, it's a great idea to tailor it as much as you can. And one example is to make that learning really relevant. A couple of years ago, or a number of years ago actually, a coworker and I taught general math skills to adult basic education students, and we actually used personal budgeting as a way to teach the general math skills and really responsible money management. And that was very pertinent to them because all of the students were very low income and needed to manage their money. But what more meaningful method or content can you have than your own budget? So again, just tapping into putting yourself in the learner's shoes and figuring out what is it that would be meaningful to them is really a valuable aspect of instructional design. Any strategies that you use that you'd like to share? How do you make learning relevant for the learners that you work with? What about the ATV group here? Any ideas for how do you make it really relevant? I imagine most of it is relevant because they need to know it. It's work related. Any ideas?
Lots, I'm sure.
It's all pretty relevant, I imagine. It's work related. They need to know.
Get your performance review.
Get your performance review, Georgina says. Yes, that would make it really relevant if you needed to learn that content and you were missing it. Or I would imagine if new products come on the market or different mortgages, you'd better be up to speed on that. Right, thank you. Now the next key, again, is kind of a composite of a couple of Malcolm Knowles' adult learning principles. Self-concept and social motives for learning. And these really make up the intrapersonal or the internal part of a person. And learning really needs to be owned by the learner. So they need to take some active role in their own learning, figuring out how am I going to plan this learning and really assessing for themselves how well did I learn, evaluating it for themselves. Social motives. Learning really has to connect to their personal or their professional lives. I mean, aside from the continuing education example, which is always there, and people might sign up for a Spanish class and not have any intention of traveling just for the pure love of the language. But generally, these intrapersonal reasons are a real key as well. So ownership, learner ownership, and also connecting to the personal and the professional goals of that learner. So if you're thinking about those interpersonal strategies, how might you help that learner be take more of an active role in their own learning? What strategy might you use to help them get more actively involved in planning or evaluating their own learning?
Role-playing.
Role-playing? So,
Sorry, it wasn't me.
So Rick, you said role-playing?
Yeah, I'm in sales. We usually have peer-driven role-playing.
So peer-driven role-playing for sales?
So yeah, somebody will be the observer, and then we'll have a buyer and a seller.
A buyer and a seller? Excellent. And what about, so that would be more connecting with that professional role, is they need to do that. So that's how it would be a connection to what they want to do. I would imagine a salesperson too, they want to sell more, and maybe there's a bonus tied to that, right? So one thing you'll notice throughout the evening, and a lot of you probably remember the work of Skinner and the Skinner box, the carrots and the sticks. People are a lot more complex, but at the same time, a lot of instructional design really goes back to behaviorism, or focusing on the overt changes in behavior, which really is performance. So we'll get into that a little bit more later. Our next insight that I want to talk about is learning versus performance objectives. I imagine a lot of you, if you've been working in this field a long time for training and development or workplace learning, you've heard of learning objectives. Performance objectives are a bit of a new take. They take it one step further, but either way, both of them really help you hone in on the purpose of that course, the purpose of the seminar. What do people need to know and or be able to do at the end of that training? So of course, that links to the activities that you want to plan as well. Now, how many people have heard of closing the gap? Closing the gap. It's ringing a few bells. So closing the gap may not exactly be like this, but closing the gap in instructional design refers to the knowledge of the skills gap. And learners come into a course, they have a certain amount of knowledge. Good idea to do a pre-test to find that out, or do a skills demo to figure out where they're at. And what you want to do is lead the learner from the current results to the desired results, or what is to what should be, or what you'd like. And so closing that gap is something you have to figure out. First off, You want some evidence that the gap does exist. For a lot of organizations, they end up throwing the training pill at everything, and they're not really cognizant that a lack of knowledge or skills is the only reason a person needs training. And it will get results if a variety of factors are there. But if there's a different cause, not lack of knowledge or skill, the answer lies in something else, not training. So lack of knowledge or skill, so if you've got a new employee or a change of regulations or a change of equipment, then more than likely people will need training of some way, shape, or form. Now KSAs, you've probably heard of these. This is really the meat of your course or your workshop. What kind of knowledge do these students need? What are the skills that they need, and what are the attitudes? So knowledge, skills, and attitudes. So for thinking about all of those put together, and for the HR people in the room or people who work closely with HR, often you'll hear this as competencies. And that's really the knowledge, skills, and attitudes you need for a role. Well, here are the knowledge-based objectives, or the cognitive aspect of learning. Again, goes back to that first key, which was
Prior learning.
extra points for Ricardo. Prior learning, yes. So building that bridge from what you know to what you don't know to make that meaningful and make it memorable. Or, as you've probably heard several times, make that learning stick. Skills-based objectives, again, this ties in that behavior is focus. These are the overt, observable things that you can see. The performance change. So, for example, if you're working with individuals that have to perform in a certain way, they have to have a certain level of customer service, you might have an observational checklist, or you might have them do a demo before and after to show that the skills have been improved. Now, attitudes are a little bit trickier. You don't typically make a class to change an attitude or a webinar to change an attitude. For example, if you made a culturally relevant or webinar to reduce racism, very challenging to measure if that actually worked, if it was effective, because you're trying to get it to a demonstrable point. However, a lot of those attitudes are embedded within the content and within the methods that you use. So for example, if you want to encourage people to be cooperative, you might consider having them work in cooperative groups or work in pairs. But again, very challenging to measure, and you don't usually see a class dedicated to changing an attitude. Now the next aspect of getting ready to design instructional, how many of you are actually thinking about instructional design projects right now or working on some? Excellent! There is a number of you, that's good to see. So when you're first starting, it can be a little overwhelming. You think, take a deep breath. There's a lot to scope out and figure out. The first thing you want to do, if it's in the scope or the context of a job, you want to figure out what are the departmental priorities, what's going on within the organization, and maybe even looking at the job and task analysis or the job description. What do these people need to do? What does this group specifically that we want to design training for need to be able to do? What should they know? And second thing, you really want to focus in on what are those target learners like. And I'll give you one example of how you can customize instruction, again, for personal meaningfulness and making it more memorable. I designed an introductory computer skills course that I had delivered to adult basic education students, and they were single moms. So we had a lot of activities where they did things that were related to their lives. One of the things we did was we developed a poster in Word where they could have a clothing swap or barter for a trade on babysitting, that kind of thing. I did the same course, Introductory Computer Skills, with middle-aged miners up at a mine site. Now I can tell you, the posters we made were not swapping daycare or babysitting duties. The posters they made was, I'm going to sell my truck. I want to sell my truck, or I want to find other people to go in with me on a fishing trip. So the same content, only customized to those learners, so it would speak to them and really ring true for them. And similarly, I developed a career preparation workshop, and primarily for newcomers to help them get jobs. So learning how to do resumes, cover letters, interview skills. And later, when I was in the United States, I redesigned it for foreign university students in the United States. People were so impressed with the materials, they said, but darn it, if they were only just fit for engineering students. And I was asked to redesign them for that audience. So all the examples, the names, the details were all tailored to that group. So same content, just a different way of looking at it. And that tends to be the way the really authentic instructional designers work, is they partner with someone and they figure out what exactly the group is like and what the needs are, and then that's how you deliver it. I like to say the next step is you start drafting ideas, getting input from your stakeholders and some feedback, because you don't want to start designing the course all in full, get too far, and then you realize, oh, we should have included this, or we shouldn't have included that. A lot more rework on the back end. Now, ADDIE model, I would imagine a lot of you have heard of the ADDIE model. I'm not going to dwell on it too long, but I want to talk about some of the more interesting things about it. Have we got a keener who can tell me what ADDIE stands for? Yay!
Analyze, design, develop, implement, evaluate.
Analyze, design, develop, implement, and evaluate training. Thank you so much. Now, those are the 5 main steps. What's interesting to know is that ADDIE actually has imprecise origins. It's attributed to different people making contributions to developing it. Either way, evidence strongly suggests it stems from World War II, when they were trying to train large groups of people efficiently and effectively, either as soldiers or for factory work. And today, it's interesting to note that there's actually hundreds of different instructional design models. It's very step-by-step, methodical, and very systematic, but there's hundreds of different ones. So which one do you choose? Well, a number of them, the ADDIE, ADDIE rather, all of those elements are typically in all of those models. Sometimes they're expanded, sometimes they're collapsed, sometimes people skip steps. Regardless, those ones are generally there. Now, this is the model I like the best, and the reason being is that it has a feedback loop throughout. So you don't get too far ahead and planning too much in detail without some ongoing reviews. So you'll do some analysis. What are the learners? What is the job like? What is the task like? What do the supervisors want? What are they finding now? What would they like in the future? And then you double check. Go back and double check to make sure that you've understood correctly. Then you start drafting or designing. The layout could be, for example, if you'd made a course for U of A, like I made one for CASE, you want to check, is this okay, this syllabus, is this going to work? Are these resources acceptable? Before you launch into then the development. So it saves a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort, because instructional design can be rather laborious. And it's a good idea to catch that on the front end. I know I had to make a strong case for the continuous feedback with somebody who was supervising one of the projects I was working on, an e-learning one. He wanted to save all the revisions till the end. And I thought, no, once it's all input in the software, it makes it very challenging to make changes, especially if some changes affect other changes and it's throughout the course. So I encourage you to get some feedback and input from your stakeholder group and your partners that you're working with as much as you can. So thinking about learning objectives, any of you who've taken teaching or even adult education, you're probably familiar with learning objectives. This is the point or the intended learning outcome of your lesson. Often we like to write it, at least some of us old school teachers, SWBAT or LWBAT. And let me tell you, you won't forget more than once after you've called a 50-year-old learner in a workshop a student. That learner is a lot more acceptable. It's a lot more acceptable term. So the student will be able to, for example, this student will be able to download research articles online from the library. That would be the learning objective of, say, a seminar. So learning objectives, they're short, they're sweet, they tend to be involved with adult education and education in the schools. Now, vive la différence, here is performance objectives. Performance objectives take it one step further. And I like to say it's the PCC method, or a tripartite method. It includes the performance objective, or the performance that you want, the criteria, how do you want it done? Usually it's an adverb or a quantifiable. And then under what conditions do you want these people to be able to perform this? So I'll give you an example. Our learning objectives proponents would probably say this couple will be able to salsa. Well, that isn't quite a performance objective. We'd have to add something else. So this couple will salsa dance correctly after 2 one-hour classes. So you've got your performance, they will salsa dance, and they usually be able to, just as a capacity. It's actually, they will for sure. And there usually is the adverb, the correctly, and after 2 one-hour lessons, that's your condition under which they're going to achieve that performance. So it's a little bit more specific and a little more detailed, might take a little longer to write. I think, honestly, a lot of times teachers or educators in the back of their mind, they already have these in mind. But at the same time, I think it's really a great idea to make them objective and write them down. So let's just see if we can walk through these. Trainees will be able to operate the crusher in the plant after practical training. Learning objective or performance objective? Performance. So the performance is, we'll be able to operate. What's the criteria? After practical training. Or condition rather. What's the criteria? It's not there. So we've got a learning objective. So again, all those 3 elements need to be there. So it can be a little tricky. Next one, students will correctly identify 10 examples of simile and metaphor after the lesson and a few exercises. Learning, performance, and what would you say the P is? Identify examples. What would be the conditions? After the lesson, if you practice. And what about the criteria with which they're going to correctly? Right, you bet. Next one, following an in-class, and this is probably taken from driver education, following an in-class activity and a video on stop signs, learners will be able to accurately explain procedure at a 4-way stop. Performance objective or learning objective? Performance, we've got the learners will be able to accurately explain, well, that's our criteria. And following an in-class activity, there's your condition. Last one, welding apprentices shall learn how to prepare an edge before welding a plate, edge, or pipe. Learning objective or performance objective? Learning seems to be in agreement. Yes, learning. So we've got they will learn how, but we're not sure how efficiently, effectively, safely. And we're not sure under what condition. After they've had a demo, after they've had some guidance, after they've worked with their mentor, we're not sure. So again, the intention might be there, but the specifics make it a little clearer. So if we're thinking about the learning versus performance objectives, I know myself, having studied in teacher education and adult education, tends to be learning objective focused. I actually hadn't even heard of performance objectives, to be honest, until I studied instructional design. And I want to know what your experience is. Which one is more common for people in here that you've seen? Learning? Anybody care to disagree? They're big on performance objectives? No? So predominantly that's usually what we see as the learning objectives. But which one do you think would be preferable and why? Anybody care to weigh in?
It's much more measurable if you stick with performance.
It's much more measurable if you stick to a performance objective. So you've got those specifics of what you're going to see and how it's going to be achieved. Great, thank you.
Is the performance objective really the bridge between, is it the transfer of learning then?
Is the bridge between or for the transfer of learning, the bridge between learning and performance? I would say that the performance objective strongly supports that transfer. It's not in and of itself, but it really is a good support because it's it's a specific of how it's going to be achieved. The transfer could be before learning and after planning that. So that's our next one. We're getting there. But probably in the workplace, which one do you think would be preferable to have? Performance objective? Any reason why?
We want to see measurable results. We want to see effective work.
We want measurable, specific results. So
Somebody's learned something doesn't mean it's transfer, doesn't mean it's going to happen in the workplace.
right, and you want to be specific about under what conditions and how you want them to perform correctly, safely, efficiently, according to best practice. So you want some specifics of how you want that performance exactly.
And you can connect it to business goals potentially too, vocational settings.
I think that's a great point. So you can connect performance objectives better to the business, and because, would you want to expand on that at all?
Well, you know, one of the things that we want to achieve with a learning program is that the learning program supports the goals of the line of business in particular. So when you have a performance objective, it gives that criteria in there. It tells you what kind of performance standard you intend that person to achieve out of that.
Wonderful, thank you. Yes, you want to have a performance standard, and it really does help align the strategic business objectives of the organization, whether it's nonprofit, public sector, or private, to the individual and what they're going to learn and how they're going to contribute to those strategic business objectives. That leads us right into our next piece, which is levels of evaluation. So Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. Anybody new to that? Is that new to anybody? A couple people, they're too embarrassed. Not me. You've heard his name. Well, we're going to talk a little bit about that. So it might be a review for some of you. We're also going to talk about the new take on Kirkpatrick's 4 levels of evaluation. So evaluation itself is really a determination of value or worth. And in a sense, it's a subjective judgment. It's a value judgment. And as Georgina wisely brought up, performance evaluations, it can also often be seen as a negative. Can also be seen as a learning opportunity. So depending on the situation, depending on the person, it can be seen as either. I like to encourage people to do evaluation and think critically about the programs, how they're running, and even how they're designing them in order to see it as a learning opportunity. How can we make it better and have that continuous improvement process? Now there's Dr. Donald Kirkpatrick himself. He is well in his 80s. He is on my LinkedIn. And he did invent the 4 levels of training evaluation. He actually wrote it up as part of his dissertation at the University of Wisconsin. And his 4 levels, the first one begins with measuring learner reaction or satisfaction. So, did you like the course? Was the instructor engaging? Did you find the materials and the activities useful? Did you enjoy it? Was the food good? Was the room warm enough? I hate to digress into silliness, but there's all sorts of reaction level data you can collect. Now typically we refer to this in a somewhat derogatory manner, the smile sheets or the smiley sheets. And interestingly, I once worked somewhere where they actually had smiles on the feedback form. I thought it was so incredible. I actually sent it to my instructional design professor. He said, wow, I've never seen a smiley sheet with smiles on it before. Now, I hate to belittle the learner reaction and satisfaction, because if you didn't enjoy it or you're not having a good time, chances are you're not going to really stick with it, and perhaps you're not going to learn as much. Although I think I can speak generally and say we've probably all had an instructor or a teacher that we didn't like, but we still learned from them. At the same time, that's probably not what we want for our learners. We want them to have fun as well. The next level of evaluation is the learning. So as Radka pointed out, a pre and post test would be a great way to assess if they've learned. Or if it's a skill check, you could do a skill check, a demo, or have a standardized checklist so you could check off what they've actually acquired from before to after. Your 3rd level of evaluation is behavior change. That is the performance improvement on the job. At the same time, you've got a whole host of variables that affect whether or not transfer is going to happen. For example, if I'm working at ATB and we've just done some training on a great new product or a great new mortgage we've come out with, and we're finding that our client service reps are not selling that product. And they've done the training, why are they not selling it? And perhaps we do a little digging and we find out, oh, the old incentive system doesn't support selling the new product. So it may not be a matter purely of the training. It could also be an incentive system. I'll give you another example where an admin assistant takes an Excel course and she's learned it, she's done very well, she gets back to the workplace and they don't install the software for 6 months. Then they install it, they say, okay, away you go. How do you think that that person would do?
Poorly, forgotten learning.
Might do okay if they've been practicing on their own, but probably poorly. Chances are poorly or not as well because the software hadn't been there. They haven't been able to support that transfer of learning. Thank you for chiming in there. And the fourth level, or the highest level in the Kirkpatrick's evaluation, is organizational results. This is where it gets complex. This is where you're going to have the quantifiable data. How much money did we save by implementing this type of program at Intact Insurance? Or how much scrap have we saved in welding in this program over at NATE? Have we actually improved the quality of the learning sessions at the Business Link? And other measures. But typically it relates to a quantifiable and typically a bottom line figure. Poll, here's a poll. How many levels do you evaluate? Who does level 1 in if they're delivering training? Good. Level 2? Excellent. Level 3? Ooh, a few. That's good. Now what about level 4? Did it add value to the organization? Which organization are you with again? Excellent. We're going to have to talk more. That sounds great. What kinds of, can you give us just 1 or 2 examples at Aon Reed Stenhouse how you measure the organizational results of a training program?
We've just started doing it over the past year because we kind of have to show that our value as a learning team. And we took actually the learning objectives and we put quantitative things in those objectives that we could track over a 6-month, 12-month period. So for example, we were looking at errors. There was a program that we did a retraining program because there was a lot of errors in a certain area. So we just tracked those errors. So 6 months later, we looked to see was there fewer errors.
Oh.
And bring that back to the business saying, yes, this had value.
Excellent, thank you, great example. So tracking the number of errors and error reduction really, and then of course savings of time and money by not having to do rework. Excellent example. So a couple quick stats on the 4 levels. Most companies do the level 1, they do the smile sheets, but the higher levels, the higher you go, the more resources, time, people, money that you're going to need to be able to get that data and put it together. It takes more time, and if you don't plan for it at the beginning, it gets very challenging at the end when you're rushing around trying to do an evaluation and you hadn't actually put that into the plan at the beginning. Very important. So, of course, the Kirkpatricks recommend that you do all 4 levels, but it's not always realistic. There's Jim, and this is Don's son, and interestingly, the 4 levels is now 50 years old. Hard to believe. He actually turned 50 a couple years ago. So Jim has actually flipped the model. He's taken a new take. He calls it the Kirkpatrick Business Partnership Model. And he's flipped the model. And if you ever go to see him speak at a conference session, he has this great slide where he actually flips a picture of his father and he talks about how he's flipped the model. And he actually begins with business results first. And similarly, he wants to make sure that it's adding value to the organization. So he starts there. What does the organization want? Then it flows down to how are we going to connect that to a change in the performance of our people on the job? And then what do they need to learn to be able to do that? And then the reaction level data. So one of Jim's clients actually calls the level 1 and 2 consumptive metrics, or pretty much it's used up in the evaluation, and that's the end of the story. So yes, they liked it, yes, they learned, check. Doesn't necessarily mean they're going to apply, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to retain, or that it was relevant or good quality learning, whole host of other variables. And the same client actually refers to level 3 and 4 as impact measures, or the ones that really stick, the ones that matter, particularly the ones that matter to our beloved C-suite or senior management, the bottom line, the numbers. Now, importantly, when you're thinking about evaluation at any level, you want to think about the results and the outcomes. And I think Stephen Covey's quote is really fitting in that you want to begin with the end in mind and focus on then later how you're going to get there. Again, looking at the value that training brings. So we're not going to get into too much of the Kirkpatrick business partnership model. It's got a few extra details, a few extra steps. By and large, though, he has flipped the model, really focusing on the business need first. And the one other interesting added feature that he's added is a return on expectations, or ROE. And this is a new take that he's come up with. He likes to say that when you're dealing with stakeholders, you want to make sure the stakeholders are happy. So for example, McEwen students that Radka deals with, you want to make sure the students feel satisfied, that they think, yeah, I've gotten value for my money. I really did learn. I enjoyed working with the instructors, but I feel competent in this field that I've now got a degree in. So it really contributes to the success. And especially if the sponsor is paying for it, you want to know that the sponsor is happy, especially if it's senior management or another business unit. So it really amounts to cooperation between the instructional designer or the workplace learning specialist and the subject matter experts or the department level people. And both the Kirkpatricks, actually, they now work together in a company, Kirkpatrick and Partners. They talk about the chain of evidence flowing from level 4 right down to level 1. And if you haven't seen it or read it, I encourage you to pick up a copy of Jim's new book. Came out in 2010, Training on Trial. He actually built it all from a single sentence that he read in his father's work, all about how one day training professionals, workplace learning, adult educators, they're all going to be on trial, essentially in front of a jury of senior management. And they're going to say, well, what value do you add to the organization? Show me the money. And so he has this whole book around this, and the concept of ROE is in there. So I encourage you to read it. He also reminds us, importantly, a couple important points. Don't assume people are transferred. And this is essentially just because they're in the course, that they participated, they were listening, maybe they had some great activities, doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be able to do it in another setting. There's a whole host, again, of other factors involved. And consistent reinforcement and practice are going to be needed to retain that. Now, we briefly mentioned Dr. Jack Phillips, the return on investment guru, or ROI king. His work largely centers on the return on investment of HR and training programs in organizations. I had the wonderful privilege of taking part in a week-long class with Dr. Phillips, and he's a very personable man, very charming Southern drawl. He's written 33 books, published in over 30 languages, and he absolutely stands by and is committed to finding that data to prove that training has added value or there's a return on investment of the training. He's convinced, and he actually provided us all with calculators, that you only have to do grade 4 or 5 math to be able to calculate ROI, thankfully. And you have to be able to get that data from different people in the organization, whether it's HR or management, in order to come up with, was it worthwhile? It's probably never going to be a perfect or exact measure, but finding that data and also doing some projections. So if we invest on the front end a lot in this training, how much is that going to save us in the long run? So like the one example we heard, it could save a lot over the years just because you've stopped a lot of the errors. Now, interestingly, Dr. Phillips there actually does know Dr. Kirkpatrick, of course, and Jack's ROI does include all the other 4 levels. So he sort of subsumed that and added on. His ROI is actually referred to as unofficial level 5. Unfortunately, well, interestingly, he has a little bit of an intellectual debate going on there with Jim, Jack versus Jim. And Jack doesn't really feel that ROE is really a concept to be taken seriously. You're looking at stakeholder reaction, stakeholder satisfaction. And while that's important, Jack reminds us that there is no absolute data involved in that. It's simply the expectations. And in a sense, that brings us right back down to level 1. Did you like it? Do you think it worked? How are the people doing? That's great. But there isn't really hard line data and numbers attached to that. So as much as he thinks it's a good concept, he also worries that our C-level people, the CFO, the COO, the CIO, whatever, all the senior management, they might think it's really nebulous and it doesn't really speak to them. They want the bottom line. They want the numbers. Show me the money that this course made a difference for people. And just because stakeholders think it worked, doesn't really work for Jack. I did include the link to Jack's article where he talks about this. I'd be happy to make these slides available to you after. It's quite an interesting read. Our last aspect that we're going to talk about, transfer of learning supports. And interestingly, I do seriously think that the transfer of learning is really what I like to call the sweet spot between workplace learning and workplace performance improvement. And I found this great definition of transfer of learning, that almost magical link between classroom performance and something that's supposed to happen in the real world. So we have an isolated situation where learners are learning either online, in a classroom face-to-face, and then they're expected to perform those same skills or use that same knowledge in a workplace or in another setting. And can they make that transfer? That is the question. And how? There are a lot of variables involved, and there are a lot of factors that could prevent the transfer from happening, could delay it, could impede it, or even enable it and encourage it and be supportive. So we're going to talk a bit about some of those strategies for really planning for transfer of learning. So you can actually plan for strategies to help support that transfer of learning before, during, and after your training. So for example, before your training, you might want to have a discussion. Russ had mentioned asking some questions of the learners. What do you already know? Again, going back to key one, which is prior learning, right? So prior learning, digging out what they already know, could be a way of helping that process happen. During the training, you might want to invite in some expert speakers in that field and sharing some examples or analogies, or perhaps even just getting some tips together and thinking about, okay, when you're learning this bank training, how is that going to be different when you're on the job? How are you going to be able to use this? Or how is it going to be different when you're in the job situation? And Rick had mentioned role plays, another excellent way to practice and have some guided coaching. And finally, after, this is where we usually think of transfers, just at the end, after the training, we could have some checklists, some action plans, question and answer, that sort of thing. And I'll give you one example of a great transfer support. Probably 20 years ago, I worked casually at a women's shelter for a situation, women who'd left domestic violence situations. We'd taken the training, and I only worked there casually. But I gotta tell you, I was paranoid and terrified if that phone was gonna ring and there was a crisis. And I thought, oh, when I'm panicked, how am I going to make a conscious, effective way to deal with that situation? And interestingly, they had a great job aid that helped support that transfer of learning in that situation for employees and staff. They had a decision tree where it actually walked you through the questions. You know, are you safe? Do you have a place to go? Is he there? Et cetera, et cetera. So that actually, even if your emotions were riding high, as are theirs, you could stay calm and focused and perform. So you don't necessarily have to have all those questions in that sequence memorized, but you've got a job aid to help you do what you need to do to get that result that you want. Another quick example, truck driver trainees. Again, you're kind of creating a nice smooth bridge, so you're just stretching them a little bit further. Having them read the manual, going on to the simulator, then learning to drive with the trainer, and finally being able to drive independently. So in a sense, it's like hand holding, but not too tight. You want to just lead the learner to the next step. Another example, how many of you have taken the CASE program or some courses? Wow, that's excellent. Quite a few people, good to see. So I imagine a number of you have taken the facilitation course, probably. I think it's taught by Kim. So I would imagine this might be a scenario of how it would look for stretching the learner. You could study facilitation, talk about guidelines, housekeeping, etc. activities, then moving into demos, perhaps video-based or in-person, practicing in small groups in the class, and then moving to actually facilitating large groups yourself. So you're offering that support for the transfer of learning, gradual scaffolding until the learner is able to work on their own. Quiz time. Are we ready? Oh my God. I don't have a prize for people who get all the right answers. So what are the 3 keys to adult learning? Jump out, anybody.
Prior learning.
Prior learning. Next one starts with an R. Relevance, yes. The next one is kind of tricky. It's the intrapersonal aspect. So both your ownership of the learning and sort of the social motives for learning, personal, professional. KSAs is your meat of the course. It's the knowledge, skills, attitudes. You got it. Learning objectives. Learner will be able to, yes. And how many times did I write a lesson plan with LWBAT? The average person probably think, what? Performance objectives, the PCC, the 3 elements. Performance, criteria, conditions. Excellent, good job. The main difference between the old or the more traditional version of Kirkpatrick's 4 levels and the new one? It's flipped, and now it starts with? Results, right, or business need. Why do you think Jim flipped it? Just because he wanted to keep selling the 4 levels? He was running out of money? Why would he flip the model? Why do you think, what was his rationale, do you think, for flipping the model and starting with business needs?
Because that's the ultimate, that's what drives it.
Because that's the ultimate driver. I like that. That's the ultimate driver. That's the ultimate value for the organization, especially if they're the ones funding it. Great, thank you.
Maybe I thought of that.
What's that?
I'm actually in Toronto tomorrow and actually flipping the model.
You're flipping the model tomorrow in Toronto?
Yeah. It's interesting because when I look at it, I don't think the person who we're presenting to even knows he's flipped the model.
Oh, interesting. So you're not sure if somebody knows that Kirkpatrick's flipped the model?
Yeah.
Oh, interesting. Well, Don, I believe, is on side with Jim. They now work in Kirkpatrick and Partners, and I think over time, the reason it probably changed to focus on business results is because budgets are getting tighter and people are having fewer resources, people, time, money, energy, and they need to really hone in on which ones are going to make the most difference. And they want to make sure that all business units are adding value to the organization. One example of a transfer of learning support, maybe one you used or one you'd like to use, anyone? A job aid? Any others?
Checklist.
A checklist. Have you used that at Global?
No, I'm going to.
You just got an idea. That was a $20 idea, Bryce. Excellent. Any others? Anything to support the transfer of learning for your learners?
Discussions with, you had a point up there about discussion, but a lot of times I wonder about transfer. People come to a course, go back to the work site, many of you probably experienced this, get back to their desk or their office, piled up to here, and the organization doesn't support the learning structurally.
So the discussions about going back to the workplace and you get too busy or you're too inundated, how do you have the time and energy to apply what you've learned? And if the organization doesn't support it, or the management doesn't support it, and they don't have time, that might be a good opportunity to have a discussion. Or you might even think about how can we brainstorm that in advance? What are some barriers you see to being able to transfer this or use this on the job? What are some enablers? What are some things that are going to help you use this? Good thought. Thanks, Russ.
One of the things that we've done too is we have regular 360s that they have to do with mentoring with folks that are masters of that.
So 360 mentoring with...
Getting 360 feedback at different stages of the training cycle.
Oh,
and
excellent.
The people, they'll have a mentor who's involved in that, and then they get meaningful feedback, and they can ask naive questions or learning questions of people.
Wonderful. So working with mentors, getting feedback, and actually I would say that's an outstanding performance improvement method is getting that guided feedback all the time, consistently, regularly. In context. Excellent, thank you. Well, this brings us to the close of Practical Instructional Design Insights. I wanted to leave you with the 4 top insights that I think really speak to me. You want to really make sure that you step inside your learner's shoes and know your audience. Are they middle-aged diamond miner men whose fingers barely fit on the keyboard? Are they single moms in Yellowknife in an upgrading program? Are they newcomers at Norquest College? Really know your audience, what kind of characteristics they have, what experience, what skill level, because that's what's going to be able to allow you to tailor that training so it's meaningful. Think about your results. Begin with the end in mind. What do you want to have them learn and know, and what do you want to have them do? And how are you going to have them show that learning or demonstrate it? Again, this goes back to the behaviorist roots of instructional design, and in a way it's a good one because then you have solid proof. And the Kirkpatricks would like to say at least, and so would Jim, at least evaluate level 1 and 2, strive for 3 and 4 to some extent, but always at least have 1 and 2. And of course, you've got to plan for transfer. So you fail to plan, plan to fail. You want to strategize, how can I help that happen? How can I help them get that transfer of learning? And above all, given that my field is based in adult learning and that's where my heart of hearts is, you want to be learner-centered as you build your training and as you design your instruction. Thanks. Any questions?
I just wanted to add one comment, if I could, and share an experience that we had recently at NATE about transfer of learning, and was that we had done some work at an industrial site where the folks were, and it was, I've got some CIT friends here from NATE, Corporate International Training from NATE, our program, Electrical Apprenticeship. We had done some work with an industrial site, and you know, the management of that site said, here's where folks really need. But on that transfer, and this only happened just before Christmas, on that transfer of learning, those folks were, and I was shocked, I was in a meeting the other day and I heard about this, those folks were 12 hours, they were 12-hour shifts or 10 or 11-hour shifts, but travel from the entry of the plant site to the actual work site was a good half hour, so half hour into the plant site, half hour out, 12 hours of work, then you go home, then you study. So, surprising enough, people did actually do fairly well given the conditions, but that's a real-life example of
a barrier.
Management certainly had good intentions, and we in our program sent a good instructor who's very skilled. But if you look at those conditions, who can really learn under that? I mean, it all seemed good and fine at the time, but
that's an interesting story. That sounds like a very significant barrier to transfer. At the same time, especially if it was employee-sponsored training and the learners really wanted it, it sounds like they probably had a high motivation level, and that maybe that helped them overcome some of the barriers to transfer.
But I think that happens more often. It's not just here in the industrial side. It happens very much in the work world. It could be happening in college or Northwest. People have got a lot of work to do, and then they're supposed to
transfer the learning.
Use this knowledge.
And the assumption is there that, well, come on, you've taken the course, just use it. And if you don't have the conditions and you're not cognizant of the barriers or the enablers that are going to help you to transfer, good point. Thanks, Russ. Any other comments, questions? No? Feel free to come up and get a copy of my card. I'd be more than happy to send you a copy of the PowerPoint. I've also got a few handouts here, so you're welcome to pick them up. I'm very aware of transfer of learning, so I've got a job aid. And I know some of you like electronic better than paper, so I'll let you come on up and pick one up if you'd like. And feel free to stay around and mingle.